house will be gone, but it's gonna go down to the, it's gonna go through the roof. I haven't cut it yet, but what I have been doing, it's gonna come.
You sit in front of St. Peter. It's cutting down that tree.
My neighbors are mad if I cut it.
For good reason.
Yeah, you know, we don't wanna cut it down.
I know you don't. No. I know you don't. I'm just teasing.
Oh, I know,
It's
but
just, I just love that.
when I am gonna go in the summer,
Oh, there it is.
I'm gonna go in one spot, I'm gonna drill down and really see how rotten that corner is. 'Cause I got a feeling right at the, yeah, I think it's pretty rotten. But we'll see. If not, I wanna buy as much as I can, as much time as I can. I'm gonna give that back to you. I'm gonna give that to you. Take this. All right. Anybody else? All right. We missed anybody? Great. Afternoon, all. Nice to see you. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. I'll note that all board members are present with the exception of Council President Hudson. Move to the next page on the agenda and note that the proof of notice is there and was provided timely and appropriately. And then move to our October 27th, 2024 minutes and entertain a motion to accept the minutes. So moved. Second. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried. All right, looks like we have one new business item and then a few under other business. So, Michelle, do you want to introduce our new business item?
Item number 3 is a resolution to adopt a procurement policy for the corporation. So just looking for a vote to authorize the draft policy. It is very similarly mirroring procurement policies that we have in place for our other local municipal corporations and that of the land bank. I will note that within your packets, so the version of the policy that was circulated in draft form last week to the board and that was posted online, there were a couple recommended just minor revisions just to kind of clear up a little bit of wording and mirror more closely the applicable policies for local development corporations as opposed to CITA, which we had initially started with. So. The changes that were made are reflected in a second copy of that policy that is also included in the packet if anyone had any additional questions or concerns on it. But
I'll just note for the benefit of everybody else on the board that I reviewed them both, and the changes are very good and provide a lot of clarity, but not really any substantive change. So if you've reviewed the first one, then you know basically what's in the second one.
Good. All right. I did have a chance to review. Hopefully everyone else did as well. And I will entertain a motion to adopt the procurement policy as revised. Second. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried. I want to let the minutes reflect that I incorrectly stated all board members were present with the exception of Council President Hudson. Latoya Allen was also not present then, but she is now, so welcome, Latoya, and we'll make sure the minutes reflect your attendance at the meeting. I think this is the most we've had all together at once, so glad to have most of the crew together. With that, we'll move on to our other business items, and I will again turn to you, Michelle, to update us on our funding agreements.
Sure. So just wanted to give everybody a little bit of an update on where we are at with getting funding agreements authorized for the 2 awards that we have thus far committed to date. So that would be the $5 million commitment from New York State Empire State Development, and then additionally the $2.5 million that was awarded to the corporation in the city budget for fiscal year 24-25. So we are continuing to move along with both of those. ESD, we have submitted the full application, and we expect that their board will be looking to authorize those funds at their March board meeting, is currently the timeline that they're working on. So at the point that the board authorizes them to enter into an agreement, then we can move forward with contract execution and kind of having those funds in the bank to be able to access. The other piece that we have been continuing to work on is the agreement with the city. In the process of coordinating with City Corporation Council to get that agreement executed, it's their opinion that it makes the most sense for us to go through a little bit of an additional process by which the Syracuse Urban Renewal Corporation, or SURA, would be looking to effectively mirror the housing strategy itself. So the same strategy that was adopted by the Common Council back in the fall, and that also the board has adopted as the strategy that we're looking to implement. The value of kind of updating or creating the second urban renewal plan that would mirror the housing strategy puts us in a little bit of a better position contractually to make sure that the activities that we would be looking to do with those funds do not violate provisions relating to limitations on how municipal funds can be spent. So by kind of leveraging SURA as an intermediary there, under the bounds of kind of what it is allowed to do as a local authority, we will be able to kind of make sure that we've covered all of our bases and we're not having any issues there. So we do have a draft plan that has been created that, again, like I said, very much just affirms the principles of the housing strategy itself. Sorry about that. We expect that we will be putting that forward for the SURA board to review and vote on at their February board meeting. The point that the SURA board approves it, then it needs to go to the Planning Commission and then the Common Council, because any urban renewal plans are required to be reviewed by those two bodies. But we hope that at the point that it's really just kind of a matter of making sure that we have them on the legislative calendars. Obviously, the council's reviewed the housing strategy before, so it's really just kind of affirming that both corporations are able to undertake work that under the bounds of that plan.
Okay. Questions for Michelle on either the ESD or city funding process?
Michelle, so that would, SURA would be able, it'd be easier to facilitate any kind of bonding that the city would do on behalf of that?
It makes it easier in terms of being able to execute kind of the annual funding agreement. I think there's still some additional questions around the mechanics of what a bonding process looks like. So we're still kind of continuing to explore that in tandem. But in the interim, this is kind of the path with which we can execute that funding agreement.
Remind me, big picture, what our fundraising target is. So this is 7.5 of...
25 is really kind of, I think, what we would be looking at that would help facilitate kind of full completion of the work over the 10-year period in the two neighborhoods. So it's about a third of the way, but in terms of kind of for what we need to be well-positioned to get started, it's a sizable portion, so.
Michelle, we know, like, as far as scope, when you say the work, do you know sort of what kind of work that you plan on doing?
So I think specifically what this helps us do is enable the funding of grants and low-interest loans to homeowners. That's really the crux of, I think, a lot of the activities of what the corporation are going to be. But with the provisions, like I said, around municipal fund uses, Corporation Council feels that it's best suited for those funds, that funding agreement, to go through SURA, and then for SURA to kind of enter into an agreement with the Housing Strategies Corporation.
So there's not going to be limits. So I just want to make sure with that, I'm just trying to understand, when it goes through SURA is going to be the final, but is it just for outside or inside? Is it going to be for both?
Both inside as
Okay.
well. So that's exactly why, and again, kind of to your point about the limits on it, it's really because we're looking to do things that would be in an income unrestricted basis, that we kind of need to take this additional step, so.
Other questions for Michelle? Michelle, can you speak to the flow of funds from ESD, how we'll be able to draw those down?
Yes, so what they're looking at this point, we suspect that it is likely going to be probably 5 disbursements of about $1 million each. So we have encouraged them as much as possible, if they have any additional flexibility, that they're able to allow with that, understanding that these are very much kind of seed funds that we need to incorporate. And I think that they're looking to try to push their committee as much as they can on that, but I think we need to be prepared for probably 5 of 1 million each.
Okay, so they cut us a check, we spend it, and then, show proof of expenditures, and then we draw down the next tranche.
Yep.
Got it.
It'll go as fast as we go, or is there, okay, we're not waiting for them to do it on a regular basis?
Correct.
And in terms of the actual updated urban renewal plan, understanding that process for approval starts with SUR and goes to the Planning Commission and the council, I think it would be helpful if, upon completion of the final draft, you share it with this group, some of whom will be getting it, who will be reviewing it in their other capacities, but I still think it would be helpful for us to have eyes on it. And
Sure. Yep,
make sure we don't have any questions or concerns.
Yep, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so no action required, just
No,
updates?
just wanted to give an update about where we were at with that.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move to the next item. We have our directors and officers insurance and some recommendations.
All right, so directors and officers insurance policy, the procurement policy that you all just authorized does give us the ability, because of the total estimate of the premium that we had is under the $10,000 threshold. We do have the ability to just kind of proceed with it. We are bringing it to the board just to flag a couple small things and just make sure that people have them on their radar for awareness. We engage with Brown & Brown for brokerage services here. This is the same firm that our other local municipal corporations, as well as the land bank, are using. They did a search for us, came back with really one primary firm that responded of the carriers that were included within their search. The majority of them were ones that declined to extend coverage just because of the nature of the work that the organization is doing. There were some of them that also declined just because of the age. In reviewing it, just kind of particularly with Caitlin and Eric Ennis and his capacity on the site end, just from looking at it ourselves, we think that these terms are relatively standard based on what we would expect for something of the organization size. So we are comfortable moving forward with this. The thing that we did just want to flag, understanding where we are at with the timing of the execution of the funding agreements. We are in a situation right now where we do not actually have money in the physical bank to be able to pay our annual premium, which would be due within 30 days of a policy start timeline. So from a timing standpoint, it does kind of put us in a little bit of a position where I think realistically by the time where we expect that we would be at with the meeting schedules that we need to get through between Planning Commission and Council, and then for subsequent contract execution between each entity that we then need to go through, we would be looking at probably about April or May before we would have the ability to cut that check. So I think I did just want to bring that to the board's attention just to confirm whether or not people were comfortable with waiting that long under the circumstances, and I guess given the relative risk or lack thereof that we might have at this point in time. If people do not feel comfortable with that, there could be some other avenues that we could explore through funding through a different entity, but it would effectively kind of require us to make an ask of one of the other local municipal corporations to see if they would be willing to help us out. So.
Do you anticipate us voting to spend any funds before this coverage is bound?
No, and so I think it's really just kind of a question of understanding that this would normally be something that we would want to get in place as soon as possible. It's just affirmation that we would be okay to hold off until we have funds in the account.
Probably pretty low risk of anyone suing us until we start spending money. So.
Can we get Brown & Brown to agree to extend their expiration date? Because
Yes.
it's already expired.
Yep.
This would just be one of our first expenses that will incur.
Yeah, the bank account's active. It's just that we need to execute those agreements to be able to write checks out of it.
I'm comfortable with it.
Okay, great.
Good.
All right.
Okay, so do you need to vote for that, Michelle?
I don't think we need a vote for that, no.
Right, for our procurement policy. Very good. Okay, appreciate you being thoughtful about that and giving us the opportunity to get comfortable. So, Okay, now for the fun stuff. We've got some guests here to talk about our small area plan progress. So Michelle, why don't you introduce our guests?
Sure. So I think several of you have had the opportunity to meet or have worked with before. Charles Buki from CZB and Eric Amy from CZB. So they have been working with us for the last several months now since the formal adoption of the housing strategy. We've been working through the third phase of the work, which is a small area neighborhood planning for the 4 neighborhoods that have been identified for the first 2 waves of implementation. We're at the point of the process now where we're kind of at a halfway point of that work, so we wanted
You don't
to,
have my house on here, do you?
I told them they weren't allowed to do that anymore.
With the no flowers comment.
Oh, you were the example of what not to do?
Yes, his example.
I have been properly instructed on what's appropriate.
Okay. It doesn't give me faith.
Well, welcome, guys.
Thanks, Mayor.
Yeah. So, let's jump into it. How's it going?
Good, thanks. We've got a dozen and a half slides. We can, as we typically do, we can run through them, take questions at any time. They're mostly cues for us as much as anything else, just to prompt the right questions and the right, thinking, particularly, at an organization's inception and at the board, And so I should first start off and say, congratulations. Anytime you're doing E&O and you're talking about, it's real, right? So it's a nice thing to hear when you start off. When we had housing strategy conversations a year ago, it's one thing to have something in concept, to move, from sort of idea to concept and then concept to something that's less abstract. So it's rewarding, as a planning consultant to play a small role in that. So we're glad to be here.
Yeah, good.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Excuse me, could you tell me your name?
Charles. So let's see if I get this right. So let's just cut to the chase on some metrics here, right? So we have done we are in the latter stages of 4 neighborhood plans, 4 areas to look at. Okay?
And for folks that may not be familiar with those areas, Tip Hill,
Correct?
Salt Springs,
Correct?
Eastwood,
Correct?
and Elmwood.
Correct.
Okay.
And so I just sort of thought, let's just sober up, right at the first slide. It's a big lift, okay? Now, the numbers here are highly qualified, which is to say, that's if everything that we've put in there, ultimately at board's discretion, at, advice of your executive director says everything in the plan needs to get done, that's what you're looking at, okay? And the way I think we sort of further make this consumable is that comes into about 6.8 a year, right? And then if we divide again by 4, it looks like it's about 1.2 million a year that on HSC's shoulders, right, for about a decade, okay, to pull that off. And it's leveraging, you're in that 70-30 space, okay? Now, so these are average numbers across thousands of units, and I'll come to that in a minute, but if you're looking for some thumbnail way of grasping what you're kind of signing up for, right? Mm-hmm. The 2 questions here, at least if I were sitting on the board, right? Can we locate 1.2 million a year times 4 times 10, and which is serious. It's a serious amount of work, right? And then just as serious is up in the top right corner is, do we have the capacity, right, to start, manage, and finish 48 sizable projects per neighborhood per year for 10 years? Wow. Right, that's a lot, right? It's a lot of checks to write. It's a lot of accounting to manage. It's a lot of discussions with staff and board. It's a lot to do. So I just wanted to set the table for that. Okay.
Charles, can
yes,
I just
sir.
ask just a question as it relates to the sort of cost? I'm interpreting that as the cost per intervention, right? Is that
fair? Now, at times twice that, sometimes 1/10 that.
I guess the question that I'm getting at is, not every intervention is going to be the same.
Correct.
But presumably there is an objective standard to which those interventions are designed to help us move towards. And so could you maybe just articulate the end state that we're trying to get each of these properties to in a way that we can carry back out into the community and be good ambassadors for the corporation?
Yes, it's a great question. I'm not sure that the answer is going to fall elegantly into 100% objective, right? So I would say that there's an objective / subjective aim that you're after, right? And that is to always move the market forward, right? And to reposition that house and eventually that block and that set of blocks in that neighborhood to compete for their share of market on a regional basis, right? So it's going to be a continual judgment call, right? So it puts the board, it puts the staff in a tricky position on a continual basis, right? So because you are going to be threading a needle, that but-for needle, right, all the time. You're always going to be threading the but-for needle, right? So an example let's suppose somebody wants to reside their house, reside a double on Tip Hill, okay? A perfectly smart, market-moving endeavor to underwrite. Now let's suppose you're given one bid with one kind of materials and another bid with a hardy plank material or concrete board or what have you. And we've got, one bid, comes in $14,000 higher than the other bid, right? It's a judgment call on the part of staff and a judgment call on the part of board about the value engineering of that dollar to move that house, to move that block. You're really putting a private sector hat on. But it's a fair question. I hope that's a responsive answer.
No, it's helpful.
So maybe this may be helpful as well, just to talk about the criteria by which you measure the stability of the neighborhood. So I mean, there's a scale, right? You're ranking individual properties or blocks based on a certain scale, trying to get it from one area to the other. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
So we did a condition analysis of all the residential structures. That forms the empirical foundation of the math here. Right. So you've got a lot of structures, for instance. You got a small handful of structures, about 25%, I'd have to look at the sheets.
Sure, me too.
26% of your structures, are top third, right? Condition, about 10% of your structures are, 8 to 10% are in really good condition, right? On the other end of the spectrum, quite a few are average, below average, or in distressed condition. So we stop and ask the question, what's the market value of something in below average but not distressed condition? What is our estimate on a square foot basis of moving that into an average condition? What is our estimate on a square foot basis of moving it into an above average condition? How many of those do we need to move by what distance on each block and each set of blocks in these neighborhoods? So those are the questions we've been asking to come to these numbers.
I guess where I'm, because there'll be so much subjectivity applied, as I think there is going to need to be, just trying to frame out the sort of buckets of intervention, right? Presumably, you're going to have a handful of properties like the one you mentioned that are going to require some sort of exterior cosmetic renovation, and that'll have a positive impact on the property and the neighborhood.
Probably 100%. In fact, I would just, please keep going in a moment, but if it's not 100%, if 100% of your money out the door is not touching the exteriors, I would seriously question the wisdom of that flow of money.
Meaning no dollar should be spent on anything but exterior
No, that
renovations?
any dollars spent on a property must include exterior work.
But may also include foundation and
And should include plumbing, electrical, HVAC, kitchen upgrades, second baths, new flooring, et cetera. But in addition to all that, we'd better see the exterior upgraded.
Again, I would emphasize kind of the dependency there is what is the starting condition? Obviously, if we're talking about a property where somebody just put in significant exterior investment and it looks perfect from the outside, I don't think that we would be thinking that any of that needs to go be redone again. But there is a I think what Charles is trying to say is that there's a certain minimum baseline that we would be looking to make sure that people have reached, and that it would, we would kind of think about it as a both and then at that point.
How do you measure that, though? How do you measure who needs what? You know, because if I was a homeowner and I said, yeah, the outside is important, but this and this is what's causing me a problem. East side of Syracuse has a lot of flooding in their basement, right? We know that because of where they stand. What if that was more of a issue for them than putting new, you know, siding in the front of their house? How do we measure that as a board?
I think two things to think about. One is the objective is not to be responsive to need. The objective is to move the market. So that's always front and center. And then I think on a case-by-case basis, staff and board will evaluate every conditional grant and every low-interest loan to determine how is this grant, how is this loan, you know, meeting that need. And I think it would be quite a few cases where you can get, it's not two for the price of one, but you can always get a both and. In other words, you can always be responsive, for instance, to a cracked foundation, to a basement that needs, you know, a sump pump, and at the same time, work constructively to be sure that you are solving that problem while you're also raising the marketability of that home.
You
I
need,
understand what you're saying, but I know the taxpayers will probably just say, whoa, what you just
so they're gonna, so you want a sump pump in your basement, we're gonna say, okay, we're gonna get you that sump pump, because obviously that affects your quality of life and ultimately the marketability of the house. But we also want you to, we're gonna give you $5,000 to put, you know, some new landscaping in the front. And so we use the leverage of the resources that we have to make sure that we're getting the outcome that we want, as we're making sure that the resident gets the outcome that they want. Is that a fair characterization, Charles?
That's fair. I think it's important, if I sort of can push through the slides for a second here.
I'm sorry.
Because in some situations, like what Councilor Caldwell was saying, it's like putting lipstick on a pig. If my basement is flooded, I don't care what you think about what the outside of my house looks like. So, but I do understand that it would be like a combination. So,
Right.
yeah, we would make it look
Yes,
nice,
sure.
but then also fix the issue. Because I don't want to pull up
thought
to a
that's what
beautiful
I just
home that
said.
I can't enjoy.
Right.
Yeah, it's just difficult.
I think you
with-
said it exactly right. Absolutely.
Only my concern is this, is when we start telling people what it should look like, right? What we think is beautiful for the market, right? And when we do the market and we fix housing, we know what that does. It raises things, right? So we have to be very careful how we're working with our community and telling them what we're trying to do. Because if I was a homeowner and I came and you told me, well, we're gonna give you money, but you gotta do this, I would say no, like, that's not how it goes. You know, if you're gonna give me something, because anytime you fix an outside and you, what you said is the market, right? So I'm looking at both sides. I'm talking for my constituents right now.
Yeah.
When we raise the market, we raise the tax, all these things happen, right? So we have to be very conscious of that. We're not putting our input of what people's houses should look at. You know, we want them to improve it, but we can't be like, well, we want you to put mulch, or we want you to put flowers. I do not want to be on anything that says that, because everyone has their own view and look of what a house should be at, right? So we just got to be conscious of that when we're doing that.
Some people like Pat don't want any plants.
Right.
They don't live.
We've struggled with that a little bit at the land bank too, that obviously improving the exteriors of these homes is a big priority for us because we want the neighbors to see that something good is happening here because it inspires them to do something. But it gets really weird because you can't dictate taste. And sometimes we've had some difficulty with that.
You're going to catch that. You know, when someone's telling me, in order to get this money, you got to do what I say here, but I'll do this over here for you.
I think I would be doing you a disservice as a board to not say that's exactly the business you're in, and you should strap in.
I mean, they don't have to participate, but if they want to participate, if they want to avail themselves of the funding, then they got to be, it's a partnership.
No, but we still can't tell people what they got to do. That's my only thing is I 100% agree with.
We can if they want funding.
But we want them to want funding too. So
Right.
it has to be equal partner.
Yeah.
We can't say, oh, you want this funding, but you gotta do what we say. That's
Right.
not right.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's a partnership. Point very well taken. I suspect there will be some cases where it's really hard to make it work, but I think, I'd like
Whoever
to
is
think
sup-
there's a lot where it will work well. And, I mean, Home Headquarters has been doing this for a long time.
Sure.
Land Bank's been doing this for a long time, so, but yeah, it's not simple, and, we can't, we can't dictate to people what we want them to do with their property, but we can try to work with them.
So my question was, so I get that part, how do we do that then? So if that's what one of the end game is, that we want to fix the outside, who determines what the outside should look like? Like, what does that look like?
Staff and board are going to be would be aggressively raising standards.
So the word subjective has been used a lot,
It's going to be very subjective.
but I'm wondering if, to avoid some of those criticisms that I'm not being treated the same way as this other person was being treated, do we need design guidelines or
Standards.
something
Yeah,
for
good idea.
consistency?
It would be, Caitlin, it's an excellent point. It'd be perfectly appropriate for the board to adopt design guidelines, without question. Procure them or adopt them.
I think beyond design guidelines, which I really like, is just a full understanding that can be communicated to the homeowners around the criteria of eligibility, right? So yes, potentially some foundation work or basement or whatever the sort of internal remediation is that may be necessary to bring that up to the standard of living that someone wants to live in their home, as well as exterior and landscaping. Because I think as we think about this as more than just a one-year effort, and we think about it longitudinally over time, I think it would be interesting and maybe instructive to look at how that funding is being allocated to the major buckets of potential need within the homes and how that is translating into market movement. We may find some interesting things, and it may not be consistent from one year to the next. We may reach a point where, we're finding a higher degree of rate of return from, investments in the exterior, or, a couple of years from now, we might be finding a higher degree of rate of return from fixing foundations or some other element that's prohibiting a private transaction. But just being able to, on the front end, design a system that helps us evaluate that and track that, I think would be particularly interesting to me.
Are we going to, or are there metrics to determine what action on a particular property has the most value-added proposition?
Yes. So as you progress, as you begin to evaluate the plans, begin to adopt the plans, begin to look at the implications of the plans, then you will shift into program design that responds to the plans, begin to work through the arrangements that you would have, the contractual arrangements, the expectations with borrowers, with grantees, so that's the work that you would anticipate undertaking really in the next 120 days.
Is this going to be owners and non-owner occupants, or just property owners?
Property owners, right? So that means a homeowner. It also means a rental property owner, right? So both own property, right, across the city. Both types of property across the city have been starved for reinvestment for decades. Both would be appropriate and both undertaken on a judgment basis, as staff recommends to board. It would be, if we reflect on, if I look at our experience elsewhere, you will have more applicants than you will have funds, right? You will be in a perfect position to then figure out, okay, which applications are most likely to move the market, and letting that be your guide, right, to make those priority decisions is probably where you'll find yourself.
Then you're going to run into, as we well know, because it's come up, as we well know, it came up in the neighborhood meetings, you're going to run into out-of-town people who own property and they live out of town, as opposed to where they are and the people who live inside the neighborhood. So, I mean, whoever presents this is going to have to be fairly socially adept at a point person.
My advice to you as a body, right, is that it's imperative to come together and really, decide what problem is it that you're trying to solve, right, and not get distracted by things, by issues that are problematic, but not front and center. Front and center is that you've got markets that aren't performing, and that are contributing to a shrinking tax base and that make your city fiscally vulnerable. Front and center, that is the problem to solve. So you have now incorporated to create a response system to that. And that's the only thing it's designed to respond to. That's it. And everything else is noise.
Is the goal, Michelle, to get clustered, so clustered like streets? So as we start, even though the applications come in, are we gonna like go by clusters of say, okay, all these houses on this street apply, let's hit that? Or are we gonna, how are we gonna?
Yeah, so a big part of the work of the small area planning process is really to kind of help guide what that phasing looks like. We know we have to work to the scale of the resources that we have available, and so if we have fewer resources available, we need to start in smaller sections. So the team is putting together recommendations for kind of how we might think about some of that different phasing, broken down based on work that would be more akin to revitalization work that needs to happen versus stabilization work. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that in all cases, there's a level of dual tracking that's happening. So even though, say, Eastwood or Elmwood, we might not be opening up grant application programs in those neighborhoods for a little bit, we still very much would be looking to coordinate different types of stabilization work, kind of property acquisition, things of that nature, proactively in the meantime, working with code enforcement and things like that to kind of try to make sure that we're addressing some of the other conditions.
Joanna?
Yes, my question is more kind of on what Rashida or Councilor Caldwell was speaking on and what you kind of just spoke on, but I guess I wanted to know more if we had communities such as what Councilor Caldwell mentioned, that an entire neighborhood is having flooding issues per se. I know some of the South Side has the same issues. We're in a flood zone, and we're working in those areas. Are we doing are we looking to do work just individually as properties individual, or is there any thought in communal work as far as like stormwater runoff? Like this whole block needs a system for stormwater runoff.
Yeah.
Are we addressing things like that, or just individual homes itself? Because not every house on this block is going to participate, and then so we fix 2 or 3 properties on the block with their stormwater runoff issues, but then the rest aren't getting.
Yeah, I would say kind of as appropriate when those situations arise, we would certainly look to prioritize, the collective we of the broader city, look to do that coordination where it needs to occur. So if we were seeing something like that.
But like she mentioned, it's already, like we, as a city, we already know where those spots are. So could we just be proactive and dedicate funding to fix that first? Or does it have to be, like set off by a homeowner coming to get funding?
I think the way that we would want to try to think about that is probably within the context of the city's capital improvement planning process. A lot of those, like with the stormwater example, that's a major engineering DPW kind of function that where dollars could be best spent and leveraged, would it make more sense kind of within that particular fund pool as opposed to dollars that are coming directly from the Housing Strategies Corporation, but we would still be looking to prioritize both of those things.
And I think it's also worth noting that, again, we're talking about 4 distinct areas where we know where we're working and where we're engaging community members to help guide our work. And so I think that those types of issues will naturally come out of that engagement, out of that, the planning work that you're here to talk to us about today. So maybe we should let you talk about it more.
I think that's a great point. So for instance, the housing stocks in Tip Hill are very different than the housing stocks in Salt Springs. They require different types of responses. Homeowners are in different situations. You know, you've got so many 2s and 3s in Tip Hill relative to some of the other neighborhoods that, so each neighborhood, you know, we've looked very closely at each neighborhood's housing stocks, the market conditions, the conditions of the property themselves, and they all merit sort of thinking it through a little bit differently.
But to all these points, I think if there was an obvious problem that was impacting the entire neighborhood and in doing so, creating a serious market limitation, it would be incumbent upon all of us, both here and with the city, to address it. So I think that's, I don't want that to be misunderstood, I think, absolutely. But again, I think what we're going to find is, each neighborhood's going to present different challenges and opportunities. So, yeah, with that, maybe you can just kind of continue to walk us through, Charles?
I'll fly through somewhat quickly. So in 2022 and 23, we had, analyzed the market. We came back in 2024 to 23 and 24 to really think through a strategy responsive to it. And you'll recall that in the analysis, we had determined a very sizable market gap, on the order of $1 billion, and a very sizable affordability gap as well. These two things were twin challenges that the city was facing. On the left, you really end up with a very tricky situation, which is if to the extent that's not closed, the tax base actually, remains perpetually under pressure, and your ability to provide services and remain solvent is quite tricky. So trying to balance these two issues is really what we saw as the imperative in the strategy work in the middle. And what we came out of were essentially, we took this large multi-billion-dollar, set of challenges, and we tried to work it down to smaller geographies, if you will, smaller, more manageable bites. And Common Council came together last spring to say, well, okay, let's think about those manageable bites. And the first bites at this large apple, right, would be Tip Hill and Elmwood and Salt Springs and Eastwood, right? And so that's what we started to look at. We really looked at what set of actions are going to make the most sense in the right sequence to stabilize Elmwood, and what set of actions, are going to give us the best return on our investment for trying to move the market as aggressively as possible and as constructively as possible in Tip Hill, Eastwood, and Salt Springs, right? And so we had initially, as you can see, we took a whole city and broke it down to its parts, and then those many parts were broken down into 4 parts to start off with. When we started to dig further into each of the neighborhoods, you can see that they themselves are very large. I mean, if you just walk James Street in Eastwood end to end, you're at 1.25 miles, right? If you're on Sunnycrest, right, it's another 1.25 miles. If you're on South, right, and you're coming up Brighton Avenue and then coming south on South into Valley or going up Glenwood, I mean, these are very large geographies in their own right. So to the same extent that we began breaking the city down into manageable parts, we found it very necessary to break each neighborhood into manageable parts. And because each neighborhood would not have its own, let's say, corporation, the Tip Hill Development Corporation, but because Tip Hill, Salt Springs, Eastwood, and Elmwood interventions would be curated by one Housing Strategies Corporation, we thought, okay, let's try to not create, it's four unique situations, but let's have a common template across it so that the curatorship of what we could do is something that could be pretty well understood, right? So each of these neighborhoods, we looked at them at the parcel level, and we broke the types of interventions into 4 kinds. Ready now for reinvestment, so that's the blue areas, right? Our color coding is a little off in these maps, but you'll see blue in all 4 neighborhoods, right? Ready for reinvestment, okay? And then there's a light, that's a dark blue. Then there's a light blue, which is code enforcement heavy. It's too wobbly. It's too much disorder. There's too much disinvestment. And so it doesn't mean you're not going to have code enforcement imperatives across all 4 neighborhoods, but you have to be especially vigilant, concentrated, focused, and ready to go on day one with code enforcement, in those B areas, right? And I'm sorry. So you're ready for now investment is purple, and your code is blue. And then the third area is ready soon, for reinvestment, but let's say not necessarily today. So you'll see those in sort of a red or orange. And then there are areas really more prone for redevelopment. Got enough vacant parcels. There needs to be aggressive land assembly, really perhaps, changing land uses. As good as your code is, possibly revisiting your code, but it's more in the category of redevelopment, right? And so we broke those down. We then estimated time and cost for each, and the way the plan is beginning to work is to show, okay, how would on a 10-year basis, right? How would you move piece to piece across Salt Springs, right? Piece to piece across, Tip Hill, year to year over a decade, where would you start your work? And then, first, second, third in Eastwood, and then in Elmwood as well. How would you sequence that work? So we looked at all of that. And what we'll be conveying to you all, probably in 4 to 6 weeks, is the very fine-grained details of all this. Each of these has been costed out. And so what we show here in our cost summaries really are, how many properties in each of these sections do we anticipate what level of work, right, being done by what volume of years, right? So that gives you your totals, right? Now, if we come back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, right, all common to all 4 of the neighborhoods, which are each in a slightly different market condition. If you look in the center here, it's build on strengths, right? It's connecting, being very intentional about good neighbor efforts, and then concentrating to get a critical mass. Now, those seem, I think, at 30 miles an hour, easy things to do, sort of obvious things to do, okay? But they're not. So building on strengths, it's a key principle here, right? So now we take that principle, now let's go to a map, okay? So building on strengths in Salt Springs, right, does not mean starting at Parkside, okay? There's a lot of need at Parkside, but that's not a place where you're going to get a high return on your investment. That's not, it's a different kettle of fish, right? And if I had a capacity to zoom here, if we were to look, for instance, at any of the purple areas in Tip Hill, right, those ready now for reinvestment, even within certain blocks, along Tennyson, for instance, Tennyson is not end-to-end in great shape, right? Some parts of Tennyson are in much better shape than in other parts of Tennyson, right? And so raising the question, how do you begin to prioritize the flow of the grant application evaluation process, right? So building on strengths is something that is going to be critical for staff and board to contend with, right? Connecting intentional good neighbor efforts across all interventions, absolutely critical, right? So here's an example. If you have an applicant who is looking for, let's say, a low interest loan, right? What you want to do is everything possible to try to get they and their next door neighbor to both be coming in for a low interest loan together, right? And ensuring that one of the conditions for that low interest loan is quite a bit of sweat equity, right? So there's going to be a combination of neighbor to neighbor as much as possible so we get critical mass and an immense sweat equity requirement, right? Right? So not only, for instance, in a conditional grant, would you be matching resources, sometimes $2 for $1, right? But it's $2 for $1 and sweat equity, right? So it's a lot of community building work and a lot of building on strength, a lot of that tied to critical mass, right? So the entirety, for instance, of the work on Tennyson gives you a whole that's greater than some of its parts. And then in the case of Tip Hill, just as an example, you can now justify moving from that A area to the C area, right? You can say our work is done on Tennyson. We're going to move 3 blocks in, right? Mm-hmm. And so those become really critical guiding principles that we would want you to. That's across all 4 neighborhoods. We go to Elmwood, which is far weaker than the other 3, at least until you get to the top of the hill at Summit. Stability first, right? So stability's got to absolutely come first, which means your code enforcement is going to play a more prominent role in Elmwood, right, than it's likely to play, for instance, in parts of Eastwood, right? So you will be managing that you'll be curating that on a case-by-case basis, right? It's a lot of threading the needle on that. And then on the other side, it's really, if you look at Eastwood and Salt Springs and Tip Hill, it's really investing for the long haul. Really, it's dollar in, what's the value engineering on 5, 10, 20 years, right? So how is that really beginning to work? That doesn't exclude those, let's say, from occurring on Clyde Street or on Lafayette in Elmwood. But it's a series of judgment calls and curatorship. For those of you who learn how to drive with a clutch, right? It's gas clutch, gas clutch, gas clutch all the time, right? It's just figuring out as you go. Right? Does that make sense? Okay.
I got a question.
Yeah, sure.
So, and this is sort of to Michelle. I thank you for being honest, and I thank you for allowing to see. But I'm appalled right now because I thought in my mind, and I could be wrong.
This slide or a different slide?
No, just what you're giving information to, what you're reporting back. I thought our whole purpose of the housing strategy was to make neighborhoods better for the people who didn't have it. So making the neighborhood better for the people who don't have, right? To bring up people, right? And I know in the long run we have to make money, but when you just said we don't want to start near Parkside, and that is one of the worst desolate areas on the east side, that just bothered me because I know they're living in poor conditions. So I'm trying to figure out how do we leverage that without saying we got to get the buck, but we also got to make sure the people are right. So that right there, that is appalling to me because I didn't know we were going at it like that. I thought we were going to try to make sure that neighborhoods were building and looking better and people are living in a more healthier environment than just to say, well, this is going to pay off for the city, but the people that are still living horribly, we just skipped it.
Yeah, so let me see if I can take a shot at that. I think, number one, it's important to note that what we're talking about doing with this Syracuse Housing Strategies Corporation is intended to be additive, which means we're not doing this in place of other things that we're already doing or will be doing. Let's use Parkside as an example. They have a new owner. That new owner may be looking to put together a tax credit deal. Did I say something wrong?
No, I'm listening,
Okay.
Mayor. No, I just know they're still living awful. I get calls every day, so.
Amen.
Yeah, so I just, and I get it, but I don't get it because the people are hurting.
Right. So again, but the point in me bringing that up is it's additive. So in other words, so right now those conditions that folks are living in, we agree, totally unacceptable, right? And so we're already working every day to try to address those totally unacceptable conditions through existing mechanisms like code enforcement, like working with a new owner on a low-income housing tax credit project. So those things are happening and will happen regardless of what we do here. We have a very specific focus. This is where it requires all of us, especially us elected officials, to not be looking at it necessarily from that perspective, but from the very targeted perspective of this corporation. I think the other point is that far too often we as elected officials, we play whack-a-mole. A problem comes up in a particular area, we go invest some money to try to get a quick fix in that particular area. And there's no strategy, there's no intentionality. What Charles is providing for us is a roadmap to, in the long term, to get to long-term benefit for the folks that live in Parkside, which is to say that if you want to strengthen the neighborhood and strengthen the market, you have to start where it's more stable, make that even more stable, and then systematically work towards those areas that are less stable. Again, while understanding that doesn't mean we can just leave them alone. We still have to do everything else we're already doing, but for long-term strategy, that's why he's proposing this particular approach.
I know, but I totally get what you're saying, man. I'm not debating. I just know when the people hear that, they're like, wait a minute, you said you know what I mean? It just doesn't sound good and it doesn't feel good, and it's not about being an elected official. It's about being a person that sees, So I just had to make that statement.
Without question. I actually think that the part of me regrets that I mentioned Parkside, but part of me actually thinks it's actually valuable to mention it because it sort of goes to the rub here, right? So, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I think in fairness and in full honesty to actually be responsive, right? Here's how I would recommend you think about it. At least here's how I think about it, okay? If you look at Parkside, right, people can come up with different numbers, right? But I trust my own math, right? It's a $100 million problem to solve, okay? Now I could be wrong, but I'm not wrong by a huge factor. So maybe it's 83, maybe it's 123, but we can call it a $100 million problem to solve. I believe it just sold for $34 million. I've done the math on Parkside, right? Okay. If we go back to my first slide here. I've got $70 million penciled in here, right? So I've got $70 million penciled in to, in my best judgment, turn those four areas around, right? If I've got, now let's just suppose Parkside was 70 million and not 100, okay? I've got 70 million here. I've got a $70 million challenge called Parkside, and I've got a $70 million challenge on my other hand, which is these four neighborhoods, right? And so both are absolutely significant challenges that the city has got to undertake. And now it's sort of figuring out, what do I do, right? And so if you go back even to a different slide, what we did last summer was we looked at all those areas. I've only highlighted, if you look at the far right map, I don't know if the pole's in your way, but it shows four neighborhoods over there. That's 70 million. What it doesn't show is Brighton, South Side, North Side, doesn't show two dozen other parts of the city. If we add all that together, right, you are at 15 times 70 million, right? And so no matter what you do, it becomes a series of questions that are almost impossible to answer. Where do I start, right? And then I would just finally come to, let's look let's stay with Salt Springs just for a second. You could do a lot of work, right, by the park, right? You could do a lot of work right along Salt Springs Road. You could do work by Lemoyne. You could do work over on Fenway and on Bruce, right off Fayette Street, right across the street from Parkside, right? But you can't do them all. There's just not enough money. So figuring out where to start becomes really critical. And what I've learned over 3 decades of doing this is that when resources are scarce, when they're scarce, you have to build on strengths, right? Go to those areas that you can sort of kind of get right fast in order to stretch the dollar the furthest. And it's a bitter truth, right? But I would be dishonest if I didn't lay it out for you that way.
That's why we need to be transparent with the strategy and say that's what we're doing. Because I know that people don't feel that that's, you know what I mean?
Totally understand.
That's all.
Without question.
I appreciate that.
And I think there's another dynamic here as a measure of success. If we're successful, and as we're successful, the private market's going to come in. And it's going to come in, given the size of our market gap, it's going to come in big. And if interest rates get lower, that's going to be a whole nother tool that has to be managed, or else it could get out of control quickly. Such things.
And to Don's point, back on this in the very beginning here, see that ratio over there of 69%? So we're thinking right now it's about 70 cents on the dollar that the corporation would put in to drive the other 30. As you succeed, that number is going to come down. It absolutely. So I totally expect that 70% number to come to 65%, and as you stretch the dollars, right, to 60%. And depending on the neighborhood and the block, right, some of the blocks in these four neighborhoods, they're close to ready to go. Yep. Right? Like you get success on James, right? Key locations on James. You get some, key successes on South Street. That number's going to come down and work in your favor. So I feel quite good about that.
But we're talking apples and oranges because, like the mayor said, I mean, Parkside's going to be, it's going to be a LIHTC project, right? I mean, it's going to be money, they're going to be able to access money that the other people aren't going to be able to access.
Right, it was really just to illustrate the point. I mean,
It was
fortunately.
a bad illustration.
Well,
Because it was different,
but it's been sold, right? It's been sold. It's in the hands of a good buyer, right?
They're going to come to us, for
Right.
they're going to do the LIHTC, and then they're going to do a pilot program probably, and they'll have access to all this stuff to really fix the place up, hopefully.
Yes, right. And so you'll get a both and out of that. I really, that would be what you'd want, and I would expect that. Okay. The plans, as you get them, they're going to spend a lot of time on building capacity, right? That's why that sweat equity is critical. That's why those matches are critical, and tying that to improving conditions on a constant basis. That'll be essential. I think you can expect as Michelle and you all work together in the coming months to really build out the program design, right? The fine print of the conditions will come into focus. They'll shake hands with the evolution of our drafts that begin to say, articulate with greater specificity grant conditions, loan conditions, the conversion of grants, loans to grants, how much of that might be recoverable, shared equity under what conditions, and so forth and so on. And then one final point on this. You won't ever want to be alone. You'll want to have the land bank by your side. You'll want to have code enforcement by your side on a continual and strategically well-planned basis. So the plans, as we're articulating them, will give that to you as well.
You just break down for me, because maybe they understand, I don't understand. When you talk about the sweat equity, what value does that have per sector? Because when I look at Salt Springs, I think of a lot of older individuals.
Sure.
Tip Hill is you're going to have that mixture of younger, active people, and on the Elmwood, you're going to have a lot of rentals. I don't know what sweat equity equals or has valued at between those neighborhoods.
Well, my mother's, who's 87, if she were a recipient for a program, let's say I don't expect her to be on a ladder, getting leaves out of a gutter. I do not, okay? But if I was in Michelle's seat and my mother was requesting new gutters and downspouts, I would expect my mother to bake brownies for the folks, who are coming out. I would expect her to be a participant in meetings. I would want her to work with neighbors to sort of figure out where do we want to take this block, right? I would want her participation, absolutely. So the sweat equity is absolutely mindful of people like my mother, right, who...
Right.
So if that's the contribution someone can make, that would be great. But if they can't make that contribution, and what they're able to do is to help us review documents and talk with us and help us understand, what kind of products will be more responsive to the neighborhood, all the better. It's really participating.
Code enforcement's mentioned a lot in here.
Yes.
Do we need to be thinking about helping them to build their capacity?
I would expect that within, if not this budget year, probably the upcoming budget year, that might be something that we need to consider. I think what we're looking at right now, we've been really digging into the data, particularly looking at the properties that are average condition or worse, to really try to hone in on places where we know that we have longstanding code enforcement challenges, try to kind of bucket them out and think through what is the best strategy for some of those properties. So I think kind of we're looking at it globally at this point from that lens. There certainly may be, again, kind of much like any different infrastructure needs or things like that, where we know that we're going to need some additional tools, but I think we just want to make sure that we're being thoughtful and that we're moving in that at a timeline that makes sense relative to kind of where we're at with the project.
We are up on the hour. I know it's not a time-limited meeting, but do you want to try to wrap up fairly soon?
I think we're there. I just would say that the plans are they're as they come into focus. If it were me sitting in Michelle's seat, or as receiving these plans and then trying to interpret them, we're trying to write this so that your director has as much flexibility as possible, right? As much capacity to say, well, I like what they said here, but not here. I want to be on a little block north of further than they said. We're trying to create something that's a flexible framework for decision-making for staff and board, right? To the greatest extent possible. I also think that as they come into focus, we like where you are. In other words, there's some painful realities. Construction costs are what they are. They've ballooned, as everybody knows. It makes the budget look gaudy, in many respects. Simply just construction costs are just crazy. They're still crazy, labor especially, right? So, but we like, what I found was breaking down these large neighborhoods into small parts, actually, created a very manageable way to tackle this. Right. So I feel quite confident that what we're giving you is actionable and doable and closely aligned with where your fundraising capacity is and where we anticipate your staff expertise and board expertise to plow ahead. I just make only one final point. What's not in the budget? Code enforcement isn't in the budget, okay? Land banking isn't in the budget. Officers from PD are not in the budget. You will need more robust presence on all three to get the highest mileage from HSC dollars as possible, right? So when we look at what we expect your increment to be, right? And then the capacity of the increment to begin supporting additional code enforcement officers, you know, it's with that in mind that we're tying this back to sort of the fiscal stability, right? Because you will need more.
And I think we got to be cognizant of both. I think Councilor Jones-Rouser and Councilor Caldwell and the mayor brought up is the capital costs when we have to go into some place that has an issue that capital can fix. So we might have to like move around our priorities capital-wise. So.
Good point. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments before we adjourn? Entertain a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
It's going to be fun.
I have not met him myself.
Super good guy.